When I think about a sermon series that I'm going to preach on, there's usually a main point that I'm trying to get across. And the thing about this series was that I knew it was important and I knew it would be helpful, but I didn't really quite know what the main point was going to be. But it came to me when I was writing last week's sermon, and I'm very grateful for that. So sometimes that's how it goes. But here it is in a nutshell, and I put it on the screen. Each generation attempts to find inward fulfillment in something other than God and are disappointed as a result. Right? Every generation, no matter who you are, no matter what age you are, you can look to your generation and to the culture see, the interesting thing about a generation is it spawns the culture, it produces the culture, and then it's influenced by the culture at the same time. So it's kind of a catch-22. But either way, the things that culture is engaged in is never going to bring you fulfillment. Some of it might be good stuff, and we looked at that last week, and we'll look at it today with the Millennials. But the thing is, none of that stuff is going to really make you look inside and really understand that without God, there is no real purpose to life. Without God, there is no real sense of belonging. Certainly, people try to find belonging and purpose in other things. It usually leaves them hollow inside because people will disappoint them. Or we face tragedy as a society. And we looked at that, of course, World War II and the Cold War and the assassination of JFK and the Vietnam War. And then throughout the 80s and into the 90s, and then today we're going to look at, very briefly, 9/11 and how that was a tragedy, right? And there are different tragedies. This whole pandemic has been a tragedy, right? And we've faced it as a society. And if you put your hope in the government, or if you put your hope in leadership or somebody else, you're going to be disappointed because they're just human beings like we are, right? And they're going to fail. And so we have to look to God if we're going to have any sense of real fulfillment inside and to really know our worth in Him, right? Because even though we're sinners, He says we're worthy of salvation, that we are worth it. Jesus thought it was worth it to die for us. Jesus thought it was worth it to live His life the way He did and then die the way He did. And God says, if you are like that, then you can be a part of my kingdom, right? And one of the biblical illustrations, of course, that we looked at that sort of highlights this disappointment that comes when you look for inward fulfillment is right there in the story of the Garden of Eden, right? Why is that story in there? Well, it serves a couple purposes, but one of them for sure is to show us that human beings always go our own way. We always try to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is trying to do things our own way. Instead, we should eat from the tree of life, which is doing things God's way, listening to the message of the gospel and responding to that. If we do that, then we'll find actual hope and life and purpose and belonging. So, the baby boomers were disappointed, and this is hard for maybe some of you who are baby boomers, because you guys had faith. A lot of you had faith as baby boomers growing up and becoming adults and living through the 60s and 70s and early 80s. But as the culture, the people out there in general, again, they were disappointed by so many things. They tried to go for civil rights back in the 60s, equality for races, equality between men and women, which is important, but it's not going to be perfect, right? And what about being anti-war when the Vietnam War happened? A lot of the people who had parents who were in World War II, it would be completely foreign to their parents to be anti-war. Because to their parents, you had to get behind the war initiative, right? And win the war. Something different happened in the 70s with the Vietnam War. The majority of the generation was against the war. Sarah and Anna keep on looking back to me. I'm not sure if they need me, but it's all good. But here's the thing. That's going to be disappointing, because how long did that war drag on, right? And really didn't even end well. And the baby boomers experimented with drugs and with sexual freedom and so on, right? All of these things probably gave them momentary pleasure and fulfillment, but not long lasting, right? Then the baby boomers got older and had kids, right? Generation X. And by the 80s, the culture had shifted again, and there was seemingly a desire to return back to the traditional American dream. Who remembers the Cosby Show? Don't worry about forget what Bill Cosby did. The show in and of itself, or think of Family Ties, or any of those shows back in the 80s. There was a desire for getting back to traditional American, the traditional American dream and lifestyle, right? And that's why Ronald Reagan was elected, and that's why people were pro-capitalism again and for consumerism, you know? But left the young people disappointed once again. And by the time we get to the late 80s and early 90s, it wasn't just disappointment. Generation X got angry and became cynical and they saw through their parents. They said, clearly what you guys have all done didn't bring you happiness. Most of you get divorced. Most of you, are neglecting us. So what's it with you guys? Well, we're just going to do whatever we want. Right? And Generation X brought us the grunge movement and a lot of the cynicism that we found in the TV shows and movies that came out during the 90s. There was a lot of forms of entertainment that highlighted the dysfunction. If you can think about Married with Children or The Simpsons or all these shows that highlighted the dysfunction of families and made fun of it, right? So the Gen Xers didn't do any better than their parents because they couldn't find fulfillment in the things that they were interested in and the things that they pursued. So, and they closed off the 20th century. So then we get to the year 2000 and we've reached the new millennium, the new 21st century, the new millennium. And the millennials, the people who were born between 1981 and 1996, they didn't fare any better. But as we'll see, millennials are kind of unique. I'll get into that in a second. But let's just touch on, again, the millennials. Think of people who were born in the 80s, people who were born in the early 90s. Me, I was born in 1984, so I'm a millennial. We were parented different than even Generation X, the previous generation. So think about it. Baby boomers were parented by the people who went through World War II and into the 50s, like that era, right? Generation X was parented by the older baby boomers, the baby boomers of the first wave. But now the later wave of baby boomers are having children and seeing them grow up, and they're called millennials, right? And they were parented in a completely different way. Unlike Generation X, they were not neglected. In fact, it was the very opposite. I'm going to bring you to your soccer practice. I'm going to bring you to this. I'm going to give you this opportunity, that opportunity. Basically, whatever it is that they wanted to do, the parents were willing to give it to them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I anticipate that I'm going to want to give everything I can and all the opportunities I can to my kids, right? So I think there's something good about this. And this has been made fun of in lots of places, but this is the generation where we found as kids that everyone got to be a winner. There were no losers. Everybody got an award. Everybody was a winner in some way, right? And we've kept that with us as we grew up. And we entered the workplace, we became adults. We think we're really special, right? And Hayden Shaw, who I'm reading one of these books about the generational differences, he said that millennials think differently because they were raised differently. And so on the one hand, it has to do with how we were raised by our parents and the fact that we were told that we were special, we were told that we were unique and we should pursue our dreams. In a sense, some of that is great. In another sense, it doesn't set us up for reality, right? So this is the interesting thing. Despite how we were parented, the thing about the millennials is this, and I put it on the screen here. Millennials are unique because we are the generation that is old enough to remember life at the end of the 20th century, but we're also young enough to know and to be influenced by how things have gone so far in the 21st century. I'm going to unpack that in a second. And just to be absolutely sure, especially for anybody watching on live stream, this series is not Bible heavy. I'm sure you've noticed that we're not digging into a ton of scriptures to try to find out what the Bible has to say. We're looking, because sometimes we have to look at the ongoing story of the church, right? And we're looking at our generations that have been living now. And so we're going to quickly look at some of these historical events, and I would say this first one that I want to talk about is probably a really good example of how millennials can remember life before and can also be aware of how things are now and have that distinction. So the first thing, let's put the slide on there that has internet. It says something about Y2K. So who here remembers Y2K? Anybody? For our young people, Y2K, do you know what Y2K is? So it was 1999, and all of our computers were going to crash and be destroyed on New Year's Eve. Why? Because the date on your computer wasn't programmed so that when it turned over to the new year, the computer would think it's 1900 instead of 2000. And so we were all afraid, the media hyped it up, we were all afraid that everything was going to shut down and everything was going to be terrible. Well, there was a reality to that, but the thing is, most companies took care of it. All the technological companies took care of the problem, and by the time we got to that date, that New Year's, nothing happened, right? But it was this big media hype. And for me, for my generation, we could remember how things were before the internet, right? How things were, let me give you some examples, and all of you but our young people will identify with this, right? If you wanted to know something, what do we do now? We go to Wikipedia, right? If you want to know just something, you search the internet. If you wanted to know something back in the early 90s and before, you actually had to open a book or go to the library and open a book, right? Instead of YouTube, which provides us with endless hours of entertainment, we had to actually watch whatever was on TV or go to an actual physical building and get a tape and rent it and bring it home. Isn't that crazy? Now it's just like, yeah, I'm done. Okay, I got what I wanted. And instead of social media, you actually had to call people or, get this, hang out in person. You would actually get together with other people in person. I'm being facetious, obviously, right? But when the internet exploded in the late 90s and then cell phones became the norm, we as millennials, because we were young enough, I guess, we adapted very, very easily. So we remembered what it was like, but we also adapted very, very easily to how things became, the way things became. So by the time we get to the mid-2000s, for example, we couldn't imagine life without it. We talk to each other using online messaging services. We don't really do it this much this way anymore. But who here remembers MSN Messenger? Anybody use that? It's basically how Sarah and I got together. She lived in Hamilton. She was going to school, and I lived in Welland. But we talked to each other every day on MSN Messenger, and that's how we got together. So that was an important difference than even just the generation before us. They didn't have that necessarily, right? By the time we get to the late 2000s, we have smartphones with the iPhone and the current state of social media. We got Facebook and Twitter. Who here remembers MySpace? And nobody? Look at, yeah, this is interesting because we have an older crowd, and Sarah's too young to remember MySpace, I'm guessing. Do you remember MySpace, Paul?
I never used it.
You never used it? Okay, did you ever use it? Yeah, for people in the mid-2000s, MySpace was like Facebook. And then Facebook came along and we said, forget about MySpace. And we all moved on to Facebook. Bye, boys. I shouldn't have said anything. Oh, I'm sorry, Timothy. Well, hey, we're going to have to get used to that, right? So that's the thing about millennials, is that we remember how things were before, but we also know how things came to be. And here's the thing, we value technological knowledge and use because Oh, we've been talking about what each generation values. Well, we value technology. We value intelligence and innovation. We are the generation, and I don't use this flippantly, where we are like the ADD generation, where we constantly have to have something new in front of us. Are they okay? Aw, yeah. Hey, Timothy, do you want to come see Daddy? Okay. Aw. And of course, we are socially connected, right? Because, again, we got used to the new way of doing things. But let me give you an example, even in music. Now, okay, so we talked about, obviously, we can credit the baby boomers for giving us a ton of great music, right? The Beatles and Led Zeppelin, all the great music from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then Gen X gave us the grunge movement and so on, and that was more, what word did I use last week? Raw. They were very raw, right? Well, something happened. I don't know exactly why this happened. By the time we get to the late 90s, instead of being raw, we got totally sterilized. Tell me if this makes sense. I got some examples for you. Who here remembers them? Backstreet Boys and Spice Girls. Instead of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and these awesome bands who were very raw, you got these cheesy pop things. And look, they had fun songs, but boy, that's a difference, right? And then even on the harder side, we had Eminem, right, with his rap, and then like new metal and stuff. I don't know, okay, so I'm the only real millennial here, I guess, because I remember being in high school when all these bands were popular, and I hated them. Because I had older siblings who were Gen Xers, and I remember good music. But nevertheless, the thing is this, something happened there where even in the span of a decade, we found there was a difference. And this is one of the main things about people today, young people today, is things change really, really quickly. You can find within a decade, you can find a whole new generation of kids who are different from people who just came before them. So this is the odd thing about millennials who even though they grew up with baby boomer parents and Gen X, siblings or Gen X influences, they wanted to have their own sort of style and their own sort of way of expressing themselves, right? And that's what every generation tries to do. And I guess it manifested itself in that sterilized pop. But what about some of the historical events that happened in the 2000s? Who here remembers the Columbine shootings in '99, right? That was a tragedy, and that had an effect on the culture. And then obviously the biggest one was 9/11, right? September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Centers and Pentagon and so on. I remember that day. I was 16 years old. I remember that day. And it changed me, actually, because that was perhaps the first worldwide global event that really engaged me and really showed me that there's something to know beyond my little bubble, right? That there was more to know than just what I knew. And then, of course, the war on terror began and the war in Iraq and so on. And we get to Obama, who offered hope and change. And sorry if you liked Obama, but he really didn't change anything. And here's the thing. The changes in the culture became such where we all accepted the way things are, right? Let me ask this question. Who here remembers going to the airport before September 11th, 2001, and how relatively easy it was to go through and so on, and how after that it became very difficult? We just thought, well, there's terrorism out there now, as if there wasn't terrorism before. There's terrorism, so we got to be careful. Sure, we'll let the government do whatever they want to search us and so on and so forth. Do you think that's relevant now with the pandemic? Maybe. I think so. But my point is this, is that every generation, again, is trying to find something to hold on to, something to fill them up inside. And no matter what it is, if they look to government, if they look to culture, if they look to popular music or whatever, it's not going to fill them up inside. Now, in the church, you're supposed to find the true message, right? But in some churches, they held on to the way things were done before. But we talked about last week about how Generation X in the 90s was the first generation to say, hey, why can't we play rock music as a part of our worship? Why can't we, do things outside the box that are different? Why not? Let's see if we can relate to the current generation and still give them the same gospel message that we've always believed in, but let's do it in a way that's relevant to young people, right? Well, guess what? Millennials are, as I said before, are a generation that remembers how things were in church before. Like when I was a kid, I went to a Pentecostal church and we didn't have a band when I was a young kid. Like that changed even at a Pentecostal church in the 90s. And let alone more conservative churches, right? So here's the thing. Older millennials can remember how things were before, but then we saw how things changed in the church. But younger millennials and Gen Z, they don't know any differently. Like, they don't understand why you wouldn't come to church and have everything be relevant to you, right? And that matters. Like, church has to be relevant to every person, and specifically young people. Otherwise, especially to young people, what's the point, right? And that's a challenge we have to face, because I don't exactly know. And I was just saying to Paul before the service, I kind of have to talk to his kids and the other young people in our church and say, what are Gen Zers interested in? What do you value? I don't know. I can only speak for myself and maybe older. But this current generation, Generation Z, I'm not sure. What is it that you value? Well, I did some research, actually. And here are the things that I think the younger people are looking for. And just for the clarity's sake, Gen Z are the kids who were born between 1997 and about 2014. So it's a pretty wide gap there, but they are the generation that are teenagers right now, and the older ones are becoming adults. And so guess what? They are looking to express themselves and contribute. I don't think young people are looking to come to church and just sit in a pew and do nothing. They want to come and use their talents, use what they're passionate about, and be a part of the church, right? That makes sense, and really what everybody should be doing, but especially we should be letting the young people express themselves, whatever it is that's inside of them that they feel like they have to offer. Let's let them contribute to the ministry of our church and to the ministry of the community. But another thing that young people are looking for are answers to the questions that they have. And when I was watching something about this, he gave a hilarious example. Who here has heard of the biblical figure Melchizedek? You've heard that name before? It's in the book of Genesis. He's an obscure figure, right? Hardly talked about. Well, the guy gave this example, and I thought it was funny. He said, young people are coming to church today, and they're hoping to find out answers to the questions that they have, like, what should I be doing in my life when I'm faced with certain challenges, or my identity, or what I face at school, or whatever, right? These are all questions that are relevant to them. But they go to church and they get an 8-week sermon series on Melchizedek instead. Sorry, but and we should be talking about Melchizedek at some point, I guess. But we also need to make our Sunday mornings relevant for young people, especially with the questions that they have. So maybe when we focus on the questions that they have, they'll say, hey, I can't miss a Sunday morning because I have questions, and I'm finding out some of the answers to these questions at church. Not that we have all the answers, but we certainly know the one who does, right? And we can work together to find answers. And then lastly, young people are looking to make a difference in their communities. So in other words, young people are not interested in playing church. They're not interested in just being part of a social group. They have their own social groups, and it's mostly online anyway. So they're looking to come together with other people who have, similar interests to make a difference in the community. So these are all things that we know and we need to be working on and hoping to see change in. But another thing about young people that I've noticed, and I don't want to step on toes or anything, but I find that they, more so than any other generation before, so I'm talking about Gen Zers in particular, are interested in social justice. They're interested in political equality. They're interested in the environment, climate change, and things like that. And I think there's something of value to each of those things, right? I think we need to listen to what they have to say and find the truth about what they're trying to accomplish and work with them on that. But there's a lot of nonsense as well when it comes to all that stuff, and I'm not here to say who's right or who's wrong, but I think there is a role for a pastor to play, let's say, if I may, to say, hey, here's the truth about some things, and here's what I believe is nonsense about some of these things. And can we guide our young people to be, yes, interested in important social justice matters, but not get bogged down with some of the stuff that is not good for anybody, and certainly not good for society. So I'm being vague, but maybe next week when we talk about Gen Z a little more deeply, we'll get into that. We have to navigate through some of those tough matters because they're facing it in high school and colleges and as they become adults. So, to reiterate the main point again, we're looking for inward fulfillment. Everybody is. But unless you go to Jesus, who brings you to his Father, who is God, and go through the process of humility and repentance that goes along with embracing Jesus, you're going to be disappointed, just as all generations past have been disappointed. In fact, Jesus even said, and this is quite astounding, he was talking to some Pharisees, and they were really, really interested in the Bible. Should we be interested in the Bible? I hope everybody says yes, we should be interested in the Bible. Is it the Bible that gives us salvation? It's a trick question. Because there is the message of salvation in the Bible, but the Bible itself, and even studying the Bible itself, is not what will give us salvation. And the reason why I can say that without feeling awkward is because Jesus said this. He said, you search the scriptures because you think they give you eternal life. That's pretty heavy. So if I may, you can insert whatever you want in this line. You fill in the blank. You search for social justice. You search for political equality. You search for environmental change. You search for, trying to have a purpose in life in this, that, or the other. And you think that in this, you will have inward fulfillment, eternal life. Jesus is saying, no, actually, none of those things will work. Only he will work and give you that experience. And so this is something is actually in that video about why should we follow Jesus and not just believe in him. It says this: if we think that faith is all about what we believe in, or even what we do, we've missed the point, because we have to humble ourselves and let God be in and through us. We have to let God, help us individually and then work through us to make change. So change is good. Social justice is good. Positive change is good, but it needs to be done in the right way, in such a way where God is working through us, right? So we're going to close our service this morning with Stand in Your Love. Come on up, guys. And this is a song that sort of epitomizes that, because we can face life's challenges and not be afraid because we stand in his love, right? Like, do you see the difference between simply doing things because we think it'll bring us fulfillment or purpose or whatever? Instead, we stand in God's love and we do things in his way.